His question is, do you find that most of these laws and bills are coming from the local, the state, or the federal level? So that is a very great question, and I keep saying all your questions are great because they really are. I mean, you got me on my tips and toes, praise God. So it all depends, right? Now, mass incarceration, as we have begun to understand it in its holistic form, does not start when individuals kind of commit a particular crime, per se. There is great work and great effort being done that is talking about dismantling the school to prison pipeline. That in many ways, much of the research is showing us that young people, particularly young people of color, have higher discipline and suspension and expulsion rates than their white and Asian counterparts in a lot of our cities, even for some of the similar offenses that happen in their classrooms. And what this has usually begun to do is push our young people out of the schools. And when our young people get pushed out of the schools, where do they end up? On the street. So if they end up on the street and they don't have an education, or they're getting picked up very early, having more contact with law enforcement around truancy or around drug addict or around drug use or drug dealing or et cetera, that you're actually triggering a pipeline from the schools to the prisons. So on the local level, a lot of our work when we're talking about addressing incarceration is attempting to create more welcoming and quality school settings, particularly for young folks of color and many of our other young folk who may find themselves on the other side of, being I was one of those kids. I was considered an unruly kid. I didn't like to sit down. I talked too much, made too many jokes. Things I still do today, right? See, I couldn't stay seated in that chair, right, and tell corny jokes, right? So I was one of those kids. But can you imagine if I didn't have folks who actually made sure that I did not get swept up into the criminal justice system? I mean, I easily could be in prison rather than speaking to you. And I have lots of friends who have some very similar kind of, I think, talents and gifts and stories. So one of the most powerful things we can do on the local level is push for the implementation of restorative justice discipline practices. Practices that keep young people from being kicked out of school, but actually figure out ways to keep them in school. Now, my wife is a teacher. I worked for 5 years as the director of student services at a continuation school in the Bay Area. So we work with all of the kids who could not thrive and be successful in traditional school climates. So I am very aware of the challenge of public education. All right, so I'm not minimizing the kind of ways that young people can be very hard to teach. But what I am saying is that these are still our kids. These are still our children. So how do we actually create an environment for our children to thrive and belong and not feel like they're pushed out? So that's at the local level, I think, is the most powerful way. I think at the county level, most of our communities do indeed have county jails, right? And I'm not super, read up on how the Oregon kind of criminal justice system works. But just more generally, many of our county, criminal justice systems have layers of engagement that we could change. So in many cities and counties across the country, a lot of our folks are held in jail without while they are going to trial, right? So there are a lot of county jails that have folks in jail off of their arrest, and because they cannot afford to post bail, they cannot afford to maybe get quality representation with lawyers or et cetera, then they are held in jail, some as long as a year, just waiting for a trial. They have not even been convicted of wrong or right. They're just being held there. So there are strategies across the country that are being implemented around pre-trial services, where we make sure that those who are being held for trial will actually have access resourced access to quality representation so they will not be backlogged for a year at a time just to have their case heard. And then many of them are being kind of strong-armed to plea bargain and accept a lesser charge to help the backlog accelerate. So part of what we think needs to happen at the local and the county level is to really make sure we are resourcing quality legal services. It is an equal protection under the law, constitutional protections under the law for a fair and speedy trial, right? So how do we make sure that we are actively implementing those kind of policies? And then at the state level, I think there are lots of reforms that could be done at the state level around sentencing, around the funding of jails and prisons over and against the funding of schools. We must all appreciate that in this, kind of moment where the economy is just kind of making its way back, there is not, nor do I think there ever has been, enough resources to fund adequately both prisons and schools. So at some point, we have to make a decision as a society, where are we willing to put our money? Now, in California, again, to lock a young person up in the CYA or in the juvenile justice system can cost as much as $200,000 a year. In my district, which is one of the wealthiest districts in the state, the city of Berkeley, the school district of Berkeley, we spend, I believe it's $8,000 per year to educate a child. So clearly the funding disparity is just way off, right? So what does it mean for us as people of faith to say that that is an immoral way of using our resources, right? That we need to figure out more ways to close that funding disparity. How do we not invest in more prisons, but invest in people returning home and making sure they have services? If we are investing, say $40,000, $50,000 to incarcerate an adult offender, but when they come home, we're not investing in their re-entry into the community, right? They don't have a job. They can't access public services or public housing. They can't apply for school loans to go to school. In public housing, many of them can't even return to their wife or their mother who lives in public housing, because some public housing agencies say that if you have a record, you cannot live. So you have live in these housing units. So you have all of these kind of policies that could indeed be changed that could actually make it easier for our loved ones to actually come back home. So that was a long answer. I tried to give you maybe some concrete things you can do at the local, state, the local, county, and state level. And the federal level, Attorney General Eric Holder has just begun to release a number of statements around addressing the mandatory minimum sentencing at the federal level. So it will be, again, a great thing for all of us to Google that. Remember the Google thing we talked about earlier, right? So you can Google that and actually hear the statement that he made, and we can begin to push our federal officials to actually deliver on that promise. Because how many of you know folks in Washington, D.C. can make a lot of promises, but if we don't follow up, those promises can just kind of go into the universe until we actually make them concrete on the ground.